Hi, this is my quantitative research presentation, and my name is Chelsea Hastings. The four primary elements of quantitative method selection are seen below. The first one is going to be the description of the study population and the sample characteristics. So you're asking the question, who are you studying? The study sample in this is going to be the entire population that you're making inferences about, whereas the study population is going to be the small sample size of the study who will participate in the intended research. The next primary element is going to be the description of the study procedures and variables. So you're going to be asking the question, how will you formally test your study hypotheses? You're going to ask what variables you're going to use. You're going to need to list the independent, predictor, dependent outcome, and control variables along with the type of variables, either categorical or continuous. And then the third primary element is going to be the description of the instruments used. So you're going to ask, how will you measure your variables? Are you going to be doing surveys or experiments? Are you going to be, doing mail-in surveys? Are you going to be using specific research instruments that previous people have used? That type of stuff. And then the fourth primary element is the description of the data analytic plan. So you're going to be asking the question, how will you analyze your data? Are you going to be using certain statistical software? Which type of statistical software do you need to use for which, instruments you're using, things of that nature. Next, we're going to go into survey versus experimental design. So when you look at both of these together, they are both quantitative methods, and you have in the middle things that they both have. So they both can prove correlational hypotheses. They both have a goal to help researchers make inferences about relationships among variables, and they both generalize sample results to a broader population of interest. The differences are that the survey design is typically more inexpensive and easy to administer than an experimental design. A survey design also predicts attitudes or behaviors of a large population with a small sample size. And a survey design proves correlational hypotheses, like I described both of them do, whereas an experimental design can also prove causal hypotheses. For example, whether violent video games playing causes aggressive behavior. Whereas if you looked at the correlational hypotheses, it would be whether violent video game playing is associated with higher rates of playground violence in kids. The survey design provides a quantitative description of trends, attitudes, and opinions of a population, and it studies samples of a population to look for association among variables. An experimental design manipulates one or more variables to evaluate how this manipulation affects an outcome. And for example, it does hold certain variables constant while it manipulates the other variables. And some examples of survey designs. In survey designs, you can typically ask three questions. One is a descriptive question. For example, what percentage of company employees support hiring women of color in executive leadership positions? Another type of question that you can ask in a survey design is questions about the relationship between variables. For example, is there an association between the number of women of color in executive roles and overall perception of company satisfaction among employees? And then the third type of question you could ask is questions about predicted relationships between variables over time. For example, does time one hiring of new women of color executives predict greater time two company satisfaction? Those are all examples of how you could do survey design. And then an example of some experimental designs. For example, you have your hypotheses, whether expressive writing causes less job burnout in the months after a writing program. Then you would have, like, for example, a sample of nurses randomly assigned to a 3-week writing program. One group writes about deep thoughts and feelings, while the other group writes about facts about their daily routine. Your independent variable is your writing condition, and your dependent variable is your job burnout. And the experiment would then prove or disprove the hypotheses. Next, here are a couple examples of survey or experimental designs. Surveys, for example, you have your National Comorbidity Survey as an example. You have your census beneficial. You have company surveys to determine customers' opinions on a product. Or you have, for example, an academic survey to determine which teaching method the students find beneficial. All of these are examples of gathering data through surveys and being able to, um, make inferences based on those survey results. Some experimental examples would be a church administrator changing church start times to see if it affects church attendance. It could be the impact of CBT on anxiety reduction. Certain clinical trials are, you would have, experimental if you're changing one thing or the other, keeping something constant, and understanding how the clinical trials are going. And then, for example, like A/B testing for business marketing purposes, you're keeping some things the same, changing some things to see how your market responds. Next, we are going to go into the elements for survey or research plan. So first, we're going to talk about the purpose and rationale for the design. For a survey research plan, you have a purpose statement where you're answering questions about variables of interest. The purpose of the study is to evaluate whether the number of overtime hours worked predicts higher burnout in a sample of emergency room nurses. That's an example of a purpose statement. Then you want to have rationale for the survey method. So why are you going to use a survey method? You want to explain the advantages of a survey design, for example, like economic advantage or quick turnaround time. And then you want to talk about the type of survey method. Are you doing cross-sectional, which is data collected at one point in time, or are you doing longitudinal, which is data collected over extended periods of time? Then you want to go into your form of data collection. Are you doing it by telephone, personal interview, internet, etc.? That's important to note. And then you want to talk about your population and sample. So you want your study sample to be unbiased enough to permit inferences about the study population. And as I discussed earlier, the study sample, for example, if we're talking about the example I gave with nurses, it would be like all ER nurses. But the study population would be ER nurses from 5 different hospitals across the country. So your study population is a smaller percentage of your full study sample. And then you want to talk about, the size of the population, how you're going to identify the people that you're going to give the survey to, and then this brings up access restrictions. So you need to then notate if there are any restrictions on how you're going to get people to answer the survey. You want to notate if it's single stage or cluster sampling. So single stage means that you know the people and you can sample them directly. And then you also want to discuss if it's random, systematic, or convenient sampling. So random sampling is ideal when each individual in the population has the same probability of being selected. So sometimes this is impossible, which is why you would need to go to the systematic or convenient sampling. And then you want to talk about stratification, and you want to talk about the sample size determination, and if you're going to use a power analysis for the sample size determination. So important things would be like, will the study involve specific characteristics of a population such as gender? The sample size then needs to reflect that portion of the people in the population. Next elements of the survey research plan are going to be the instrumentation, and then we'll talk about the variable table for a bit. So in instrumentation section, you want to include the survey instruments that you used. You want to include if this was an instrument that was designed for this particular research, if it was a modified instrument, or if it was an instrument developed by someone else. If it is an existing instrument, you want to record the validity of that instrument. And the validity means you want to make sure that in the past, it drew accurate references for this particular research. Then you want to talk about the reliability of the instrument. So you want to make sure that you have consistency with your results, and with the same group of people, you would be able to score relatively similar from one time period to another. Another piece of reliability that's important is the inner rate reliability. If you are using, for example, a third party like a judge or an expert to give a score for something, you want to make sure that they're scoring similarly each time for consistency. Then you want to talk about the sample items and the content of the instrument. So you want to include samples of your instrument in your research plan. You want to include any of the major sections of the content and any scoring criteria. For example, if you're using like continuous scales, which would be strongly agree to strongly disagree, or if you're using categorical scales, which would be like yes, no, or rank of importance. And then you want to make sure that you have your pilot testing plan in your survey research plan, and you want a plan for the administering the survey. So you want to make sure that your instrument is appropriate, which is why you would include the pilot testing plan in there. And then for the variable table, you just want to include all of your variables that are going to be in this. For example, like if you're going to look at grants, you would have the amount of grants funded as a variable name. And then your definition would be, it's the total number of grants from a faculty member received in their first 7 years. And then you would say how you're going to measure that specific variable. For example, you would use the sum across questions 16, 17, and 18. So next you have your data analysis in your survey research plan, and this is your outline plan for data processing and analysis. In that you want to include the information about the people who did or did not return the survey, and you want to determine if the non-respondents' responses would have altered the data. So one solution to that could be, for example, to like call some of the non-respondents and determine if their answers would have differed substantially from the respondents who did answer. And that's, your response bias that you're determining. And then you want to plan to provide a descriptive analysis, and you also want to look at scales. You want to look at like the means and standard deviations and range of scores for the variables. And you also want to include a plan to evaluate the missing data that if people didn't answer certain things in the survey. The scales are included in the instrument, and then you want to discuss if reverse score scales are necessary and how total scale scores would be calculated if you need that. And then you also want to talk about statistics and reasoning for statistical testing, and you want to explain like why a particular statistical test was chosen and mention the assumptions of that test. And then finally, you want to present your results in a table or figures and interpret the results that you gathered. Then you have you need to pre-register your study plan. So this would be stating your goal. And if your goal is an exploratory or new hypothesis, you don't necessarily need to pre-register. But if you're confirming or formally testing an already existing hypothesis, you must pre-register your study plan. And the last part of the survey research plan is the results and discussion. So in this, you want to have your reporting results and your statistical significance. So in this, you would generate your p-value to determine if the probability of observing results in the population is as extreme as the results from the study. And that's an important value to generate for your discussion. And then you want to report your statistical test used. So you want to understand like what statistical tests did you use? What like were they useful? Were they good? What did they give you? And then you want to understand your confidence interval and your effect size. Your confidence interval, the higher the percentage, the better. So basically, the higher the percentage means you're more confident that the results would represent the true population value that you were evaluating. And then your effect size, it would vary for different statistical tests. So it shows the practical significance of the results apart from inferences applied to the population. So these are both really important elements to have in your results and discussion portion. And then you want to discuss your main findings and their place against previous studies. So what are the implications of these results? Are these results consistent with previous studies, or do they refute previous studies? And do your research findings address gaps in the current research? Are some examples of the questions that you could answer here. And that is it for the elements of the survey research plan. Now, moving into the critical elements for an experimental research plan, we're going to start with your participants and design. So you need to include how you're going to recruit participants, and in this you need to include, any inclusion or exclusion criteria. For example, if the participants must be 18 years or older, and if they must speak English, are two examples of criteria that you could include. Then you want to make sure that you address how the assignment will be randomized. So a true experiment is when individuals are randomly assigned to different groups in the experiment, but sometimes that's not always possible. So if that's not possible, you need to explain, how you're going to randomize people, and you want to describe how and when these assignments will take place. Then you want to move into talking about your sample size decision. So your sample size should be a significant, amount of people that would give you a detectable difference between the groups and the conditions that you're testing. And then you want to talk about your design statement, which would specify your variables. So an example of a design statement would be the experiment consisted of a one-way, two-group design comparing burnout symptoms between full and part-time nurses. So it explains your variables, it explains your what you're testing and your hypothesis and what your experiment is assessing. And so then you also want to potentially pre-register your study plan so that it can be recorded, and you want to make sure that you have your hypothesis in your experimental research plan. Moving into the procedure part of the experimental research plan, you want to include your type of experiment. So whether that's going to be a pre-experimental, quasi-experiment, or true experiment type of experimental research, you want to include that. And you want to include the independent variables and the manipulation check on that. So will your study successfully manipulate the independent variable? Is there one or more independent variables? You need to include all of those things. And then your dependent variables, you need to include if there are multiple ways to measure the outcome of this experiment, and if there are, which one will you choose, or are you going to choose multiple? And then finally, you want to include any other variables that are relevant, for example, like demographics of the participants, for example, like gender or ethnicity. And then you also want to include if you're going to have variables that contribute to noise or bias to the study. For example, like during different parts of the day, maybe self-esteem levels rise or fall. And so maybe you would need to measure and record self-esteem levels at a specific time of day to avoid that. And then you also want to look at blinding, which would be, helping eliminate that experimenter or participant bias, whereas either the experimenter or the participants or both are blind to who is in what group for the study so that the bias is reduced as much as possible. And then you also want to include the chronological sequence of events that you're going to follow in the experiment. The next elements of the experimental research plan would be the measures. So you want to include your instruments that you're using and your the reliability and the validity of those, just like you did in the survey research plan, and include the scales and the items for the instruments. You also want to include the materials used for the manipulated variables, as well as a potential cover story if you're wanting to have one. This would potentially help keep participants blind, so it's sometimes a good idea to have a cover story for your experimental research plan. And then you want to move into your threats to validity. So your threats to validity could be like internal validity threats, which would be things that occur with the participants that threaten the ability to draw correct inferences from the data. For example, history, right? So as time passes during the experiment, events can occur in the participant's life and influence the outcome of the experiment. You would want to notate that, and maybe there's not anything that can be done to prevent that, but notating it in the experimental research plan is important. And then another type of threat could be external validity threats. These would be things that can influence the researcher to draw incorrect inferences from the sample data collected to other persons. For example, the same same example for internal history, if you take that, but as an external threat, what it would mean would be experiments are typically time bound. They're done in one specified time. And so you might not be able to make inferences about past or future situations on just one study, and you would need to complete that at in future periods of time. And then you also want to include your study data analytic plan. And this would include like descriptive statistics, for example, frequencies, like how many male and female participants were in the study, or like means, like what's the mean age of the study, or standard deviations. And then you want to include your preliminary analysis. So an example of that would be like the success of randomization. How successful were you in randomizing people into the groups? And then you want to talk about your inferential statistical tests. So are you going to be using, like, what statistical tests are you going to be using? And then are you going to be using like factorial designs, which would be used if you have more than one independent variable that you're testing, and you would want your statistical software to be able to make correlations between all of the data. And then if you're using a single subject design, it's a simpler data analysis that you would need to do. Moving into the results and discussion portion. In this portion, you want to include your interpretation of your results, and you want to write your discussion section. So in your discussion section, you would answer questions such as like, was your hypothesis supported or refuted? Was your independent variable manipulation effective? Why or why not? Why or why not were the results significant or not? And implications of results for science and society. So how are these results going to like what implications do they have with further research? And did previous studies, were there gaps that were identified, or did your findings support those past studies, etc.? So you want to include all of that in your discussion. Then let's talk about, and finally, this is the final slide before the resources. Let's talk about the application in marriage and family therapy. So with your quantitative research components, I have listed in the left, we have your study population and sampling size, you have variables and hypotheses, you have instrumentation and pre-registration and transparency. And then on the right side, I have how these apply in the marriage and family context. So for the study population and sampling size, the way that it applies in MFT world is that it ensures proper representation of real world families and family situations. So if you're making sure that you have a good sampling portion and that whatever you're researching or testing, it, percentage wise, responds to what the real world criteria is, then that means that you're diverse in your sampling size, and you're representing what actually could happen in the real world, which is very applicable for MFT. And then for number 2, variables and hypotheses, you're taking theoretical constructs and you're changing them into measurable values. So for example, the way this could apply in MFT is if your theoretical construct is like marital conflict resolution, and then your measurable value could be like using EFT will help couples improve their conflict within their marriage more than using CBT. And with this, you would be able to have the measured results of if EFT is more helpful than CBT is. And for number 3, the instrumentation, you're getting reliable and valid measurements for therapy relevant topics. For example, like the dyadic adjustment scale for marital equality is a good example of an instrument that you can use in the MFT context. And then finally, pre-registration and transparency. This ensures that counselors and therapists are using evidence-based practices. So it makes sure that you're able to be confident and that you're using replicable science for, your recommendations or your methodologies that you use in your practice. Here is a list of my resources, and that is it. Thank you for listening.